important, well, this is all important, obviously, but you wrote a great piece talking about 287G agreements. I'm not seeing a ton of discussion about how the administration is deploying this, which is attempting to enlist local law enforcement into their deportation efforts. Just for a little bit of background, can you talk about the history of 287G agreements and when they were first deployed? And then we can talk about the present day.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of interesting because 287G is why I got into immigration research in the first place. I started doing research in 2009, 2010 as a graduate student because that was an era of this policy being rolled out, and a lot of us found major issues with it, but I really wanted to understand it. So here's the short story. Broadly speaking, the courts have said that individual states and counties can't do their own immigration enforcement because we can't have 50 different states doing 50 different types of immigration enforcement. There's 3,000 counties in the country. We can't have 3,000 counties having their own laws around immigration. However, there is a way to get around that. And in 1996, Democrats and Republicans together passed policy, changes to the law that said, actually, we are going to allow local law enforcement to do this if they signed an agreement with the federal government. And it's called 287G because that's the section of the law, the Immigration and Nationality Act, that specifies these requirements. Now, this was a program that was not really used for the first many years. It wasn't until after 9/11 that the first 287G agreement was signed. And it just
Florida in 2002 by Jeb Bush.
That's right. The president's brother is the first one to sign one of these agreements. So Florida is kind of home and ground zero for 287G. Now, it rolled out, it took years for it to roll out. It expanded during the late Bush administration, early Obama administration. But because it received so much criticism, in particular, one type of 287G agreement called a task force model agreement, we really saw it taper off by the end of the Biden administration. And task force agreements are very important here. Some 287G agreements basically mean that if anyone gets booked into a county jail, that county jail can check this person's immigration status and ask them questions and potentially put them into the deportation process. Really an unprecedented power. But to be honest, it never really included that many jails, even at its height. And then the task force model is a bit more egregious, I would say, in the sense that it sort of gives police officers and sheriffs the ability to do immigration enforcement when they're just out pulling people over, talking to people on the sidewalk. So it's much more expansive. You don't even have to be in a jail to be affected by a task force model type of 287G.
A few questions about that. One, what was the nature of the criticism that caused them to be phased out, as you say, by the end of the Biden administration? And two, was there a version of, was that the authority that Arizona was exploring when they were trying to get cops to racially profile people to pull them over and ask for their papers? What was that, like 5 or 6 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely, SB 1070. So basically, yes, so the first question, the criticism of it has been that by giving immigration enforcement powers to your local law enforcement, one, they're not really trained to do that. Even with the short training that they provide. Two, it potentially alienates communities that law enforcement need to work with through a community policing model. Immigrants are more likely to be victims of crimes than to be perpetrators of crimes. And third, 287G is just a civil rights violation magnet. There's just all kinds of issues and many, many lawsuits. It's potentially very expensive for these agencies who sign on. They start pulling over green card holders and U.S. citizens and potentially on the basis of race, which has huge consequences. So that's basically where the criticism was. And reforms in 2012 basically eliminated the task force model because there were just too many problems. If we remember that time period, this is the time period of Joe Arpaio, marching immigrants around in pink jumpsuits in the desert and tents, just a really terrible model. So that's why that went away.
And was that, speaking of Arpaio, was that part of the justification that was used by the Arizona state legislature? I forget exactly how that passed.
Yeah, that's right. And so that was an agreement that Sheriff Arpaio signed with the Department of Homeland Security. But then basically what was happening at that time is partly because of 287G, there was a real expansion of saying, hey, we want this at the state level. And the state of Arizona was basically saying, we want to do this without signing a 287G. We just want to pass a state law that looks like this, the Show Me Your Papers law. Now, interestingly, that law that Arizona passed did not all stand up. Some of it did, some of it didn't. The court struck a bunch down. But Florida has basically done the same thing times 100. They've said, well, we're not going to create our own law. We're going to create a law that requires all of the agencies in the state to sign on to 287G. In some ways, it's a smarter policy than the old Arizona approach, just because it is more legal, and now they're doing it. So what we've seen under this administration is the number of 287G agreements has almost quadrupled in just over 100 days. Not only that, a lot of them are in Florida. Basically, Florida is a giant petri dish of experimental immigration enforcement. Almost every enforcement agency in the state, not just your traditional ones, but also Fish and Wildlife, the Attorney's Office, Department of Taxation. I mean, all of these agencies are colleges and universities are signing on. So the whole state is just saturated in these policies. And worse yet, they brought back that task force model agreement that was so criticized before. And we've seen the most growth has been among task force model agreements. So it's just a real quagmire at the moment.
The current grill, which is completely electric, I think is going to allow people who don't grill to finally break up.
Great work. And the fact that the entire state of Florida is engaging in this is deeply disturbing, because as you write about, that most previous 287G agreements were with county sheriffs. Arpaio is a great example of that. Can you talk about that incentive and why sheriffs were initially the parties that agreements were met with, and how and comparing that to Florida's expansion and even the other states that have signed these agreements like North Carolina and Georgia?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the sheriff's office in the United States plays a very interesting role. We talk a lot, when we talk about law enforcement, we're usually talking about cops and police departments. And the sheriffs kind of get overlooked, but the sheriffs are a really unique and very powerful office, mainly because they control the jails. So in any county, everyone who gets arrested, whether it's arrested by a police department, state highway patrol, or someone else, they all go to the jail. So basically, from ICE's perspective, if you want to increase your immigration enforcement capacity, you just get your agents and you get your technology plugged into the jail, and then anyone who goes to the jail, they're going to get screened for immigration purposes and potentially put into the deportation process. Now, so that's why sheriffs have been so important. Now, there's different ways of looking at this, and there's a lot of different perspectives. I think that's still a problematic model. However, at least if you're getting checked at the jail, there does have to be some initial, encounter, some initial arrests, maybe some initial charges. Again, I'm not saying it's legitimate, but there is an extra barrier.
A pretext, right.
Some kind of pretext, exactly, which is not always legitimate, but it's there. The task force model means you don't have to get booked into the jail. They don't even have to bother with taking you in. They can just, run your fingerprints, ask you questions while you're walking down the street, while you're driving home, or you're driving to the grocery store. And so in that way, it's a much more expansive way of saturating our everyday world with immigration enforcement in a way that the jail model alone doesn't do.
And you have said now that that these agreements have quadrupled. Where are they most concentrated? We've established Florida, but your piece on this, which I do think calls it the deportation army. says it's largely concentrated in the southeast of the country. Is that still the case?
Yes, that's still the case, although we're seeing a lot of other states come online, including in the Northeast and the Midwest. So it continues to expand. Oklahoma, I've seen a bunch of new agreements signed in Oklahoma for some reason, a few new ones in Wisconsin, and then counties in my home state of Ohio, like Butler County, are also coming back online with 287G. Some of these agencies used to have them. They went away, they stopped participating in the program, and now they're coming back online. But Florida is really where most of the action, I think about half or a little bit more than half of all 287G agreements right now are all in Florida.
And this, to wrap up here, Austin, this essentially means that local law enforcement, and even as more than law enforcement, if you're a state agency, can any state agency enter into this kind of agreement with the federal government?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any restrictions that would prevent any agency from entering in with federal government. I would assume that that it would be agencies that have some sort of law enforcement capacity or arrest authority of some kind. So even Fish and Wildlife, I mean, game wardens usually have arrest authority. Yeah. They have some law enforcement capacity. So I'm not aware of any restrictions, so we really have to watch closely about who's going to be signing on.
Lastly, before we let you go, if you could just end our conversation talking about the implications of it and maybe giving some tips to people who might be in these states that have breached these agreements.
Sure. Having done research on this for a long time and talked to immigrants and attorneys and law enforcement in these areas, I remember talking to folks in North Carolina who they were very aware of which counties had these 287G agreements, and they would drive around them just because, the consequence of being arrested in a 287G county can be so radically different than a non-287G county right next door. So one is just awareness. Two is just, if to the extent that you have documents stay hyper documented. And keep copies and backups with other people. And third, and again, I hate to say this, but just have a plan. I think it's more important than ever for immigrants, whether you're documented or undocumented, or if you're a citizen and you have an immigrant background and you feel like you might be someone who could be targeted by law enforcement based on how you look in some way. It's just a good idea to have a contact person who understands your situation. And can react responsibly, God forbid, should something happen.
Actual last question, because this is one of our viewers, I am her name, Parade of Idiots, says, do the governors need to sign on to a state agency signing on to this?
Governors don't have to. The governors could play a role in either incentivizing or disincentivizing it, of course, and state legislatures probably could come up with some prohibitions or could further encourage like they did in Florida. I will say that there's already been one sheriff's office, and I'm forgetting the location off the top of my head, but there's one sheriff's office already who signed up during the Trump administration and has already pulled out because of local pushback against this policy. So sheriffs are elected officials. Remember that. And if this is a policy that you don't support, it doesn't hurt to let people know.
Austin Coker, everybody should check out your Substack, Austin Coker, KOCHER.substack.com. I check your writing multiple times a week to keep updated on what's happening with immigration. So I really encourage everybody to subscribe and read your writing. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Emma.